Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, distinguished audience. Volodya, thank you for organizing, and everyone, the team that was helping to organize this conference. It has been a huge pleasure so far, an intellectual feast, so I'm hoping we will keep it up to that standard today as well. What I'm going to present today is an attempt, in just one sentence, to test for determinants of regional variation in corruption perceptions in Russia. And you might have noticed that corruption issue has not ever been really far away from the foreground of political life in Russia, but in the recent few years has really acquired an additional political relevance and a big part of the political game. Those of us who do not sleep at night follow the clash between Navalny and Usmanov, of course, but the more other recent cases, Kremlin-initiated cases, of course, include proceedings against high-ranking state officials in Russia, ministers of defense, ministers of economy, governors, and many other high-ranking state officials in the regions, municipalities, etc. Similarly, the corruption issues are brought to the foreground by the opposition activists and politicians as Alexei Navalny. So there is, on the one hand, a political relevance, I think, to this research, and additionally, there is sort of a personalized study motivation for me to do this as a continuation of a recent study I did on business environment in Russian regions using BEEP's data, business environment and enterprise performance data, which I will talk about later. The study brought some contradictory results on corruption and corruption perceptions, and I finished the conclusions of that work by saying that more needs to be done on trying to make sense of what's happening with corruption perceptions and how to make sense of these contradictions. So this is a very preliminary attempt to try to deal with that. The results I will present are a bit of half-baked. However, I'm hoping that they will be a good starting point for just discussion, and I very much welcome your suggestions and comments. So this is not the end of the project, this is very much a beginning of the project that I want to present. Of course, there are notorious difficulties in the study of corruption generally. It is secret, illegal, informal, usually. And there is, notably related to that, a bias in underreporting. There have been scholars who have tried to find ways to find methods to capture the degree of underreporting. I haven't been able to do that, at least for this study right now, but I wanted to note that that problem is being realized. And frequently corruption studies are based on surveys, more recently maybe a bit on experiments, but my study today uses the data that is survey-based. And of course, the propensity of respondents to admit or to give an accurate information about corruption would vary, and the degree of underreporting could vary as well. And one of my hunches is that the nature of political economic relations in the region would determine the propensity to underreport or to be more upfront about corruption in the regions. And of course, there is also quite a complex interpretation for what do we think under corruption perception, or what do respondents mean when they talk about their perceptions of corruption. And in the general literature, it has been noted that frequently in the population and among economic actors as well, corruption frequently stands for sort of just some general dissatisfaction. It's an umbrella term that reflects usually dissatisfaction of people with regard to authorities, with regard to unemployment, with regard to public policies, etc. So this is sort of a caveat to start with. Let me now turn to the specificities of this particular exercise I've done for today's presentation. I used the data from Business Environment and Enterprise Performance Survey for 2001. The World Bank, along with EBRD, has been producing this data. Survey is done pretty much every 4 years, and the 2011 survey has been regionally representative. Usually it is just nationally representative, but this time it gives us an opportunity to test for regional variation. It's a firm-based data, so senior managers of about 120 firms per region in 37 regions have been given a very long questionnaire which contained questions concerning degree of administrative burden, administrative corruption, and also state capture. So one of the intentions of this survey was to try to tap into, to create a corruption indicator, a measurable corruption indicator, and they've conceptualized this indicator into at least 2 types. Sort of corruption linked to administrative corruption when state officials are expecting bribes, informal payments, or gifts for meddling with formal regulation, so administrative corruption, and also the measure of state capture, which they have the survey organizers thought about as actions that are aimed at influencing legislation, rules, regulations in the region. So the questions would be, something like, in the field of your business, and of course various different sectors in the economy have been represented, what do you think is the need for a firm like yours in informal payments and gifts to deal with? And then the choices, say, with courts, with tax authorities, with customs and imports authorities. There will be a question. There is a question on a more general need for informal payments, just frequency of bribes. I'll talk about it. And in terms of state capture measures, there were 3 questions. One dealing with what is the impact or the effectiveness of individual actions to impact decisions by parliamentarians, by state officials, and by regional officials. So looking at parliament, at federal level officials, and at the regional level officials. Okay, and this survey also attempted to distinguish, to try to tap into both real corruption and perceived corruption. Most of the questions concern perceived corruption, so they ask respondent to estimate their view on corruption, on the need for these payments, and the actual corruption was measured. I will present just one indicator here, a share, sort of basically report a share, an estimated share of annual sales spent on informal payments in the line of your business. And there were also questions of, how many days did it take you to get a water connection or a license, construction license, and then a sort of a second question following that was, did you have to pay? And was an informal payment expected? So that was also a measure of actual corruption. Okay. Let me just demonstrate some descriptive statistics for just a few, I think just 2 of the questions what we have here. So the share of sales used for informal payments. You see on the left side, it's a percentage from 0. You see the region where the least share is reported is Smolensk Oblast, which is not quite 0, but 0.1 or 0.2, and with the highest Bashkortostan, followed by Leningradskaya Oblast, by Samara, Chelyabinsk, Tver, I just wanted to give this graph, especially we have here people who do know the regions and what's happening, and one of my hunches was to actually combine statistical analysis with micro-level understanding of the regions, so some patterns could be seen here. So that's what the data shows on that indicator for the regions. The least reporting is done in Smolensk, Belgorod, Khabarovsk, Kaluga, Stavropol, Mordovia, which is to me an interesting, very interesting region. Anyway, let me follow with the second indicator for corruption perceptions, and this is respondents were asked, what is your assessment in your line of business again of to what extent is corruption an obstacle to the operations of your firm? And the answers could be from 0 till 4, no obstacle. The middle answer is moderate, minor obstacle. The middle is moderate obstacle, a major obstacle, and very severe obstacle. And you see again on perception-based indicator, also Smolensk leads the good regions, and on the other side you have St. Petersburg, Leningradskaya Oblast. Note I've mentioned that already. Rostov Oblast, Moscow city. I can come back to these graphs later on, but this is just to demonstrate how the data looks on the dependent variable side. Okay, how did I think about the hypothesis and operationalization? And here, I have to be frank, I didn't have a theory to start this investigation with. And as I thought about the data I have and the things that I can do with it and reading corruption literature, I thought one way to organize analytical approaches to studying corruption is by looking at more rationalist, institutionalist approaches and juxtapose them to sociological-based approaches. With the rationalist view on corruption, which is usually done by economists, but also in political science, it is a view that treats corruption as a result of the government failure and individual actions that could be treated by, so to say, through institutional reforms. That corruption is a result of cost-benefit calculation by rational actors, and corruption could be resolved by changing the incentives, by increasing the costs, or improving the monitoring, or doing things like that. And the sociological view on corruption that has been promoted more and more recently by sociologists, anthropologists, and even some political scientists looks at corruption in at least, in very different ways, but number one, it's looked at as part of, or it's influenced by sociocultural norms, as corruption as actions are embedded in the expectations, in the social environment, in the social context. And it could also be looked through relational lens that is, corruption is an exchange where sides to this exchange do not always look at this act as a corruption. And I was thinking at night as preparing this presentation when I couldn't sleep that someone being asked in the Russian context, were you expected to give a bribe or to give a gift at a tax meeting, right? If you had a meeting with, I don't know, people who you really depended on, and you could have given it without thinking that it is expected of you. It's just your sincere gift understanding of how things work, and well, I want to, that someone is providing certain services to me and I want to give a gift. So even this question of, was an informal payment expected, right, doesn't quite capture the respondent's understanding that maybe I have given an informal gift, an informal payment, but it was not expected. I gave it out of my own volition. And sociological approach, maybe more nuanced in trying to capture this. So based on these two bigger, more general analytical approaches, I tried to articulate hypotheses that could be tested. And within the rationalist view, I used Schleifer and Vishny's very famous argument about the greater negative externalities linked to decentralized corruption versus centralized corruption. So if there is a center coordinating, a central power, authority, institution, actor that coordinates the actions within the system, the degree of corruption or corruption will be more benign than in the system which is decentralized, and you have more rapacious actors expecting at each level certain payments, but with the economic actor not really knowing what to expect and when that expectation is there. So in the more coordinated centralized system, there is more predictability. Economic actors like that. And so to tap into this centralized versus decentralized corruption, I dealt with the concept of political machines. And I thought, okay, if we have more integrated machine-like political systems in the regions, probably they would be close to this more centralized vision of corruption versus where those machines are non-existent, where there is more pluralist competition and absence of such strong machines, you would have more decentralized. I am again open to suggestions about how to differently think about these issues. To measure the strength of the political machine, I used two indicators: margin of victory and voting turnout. The data was for both of these indicators was for 2011. Wow, I'm really late. For 2011 parliamentary elections. Okay. I will just go through very quickly through the hypothesis. The two other ones linked to the rationalist perspective bring in the role of the dependence on federal transfers in the regional budgets and the role of the dependence on natural resources. My thinking here was that if regional authorities have access to sort of unearned gift-like resources, think foreign aid, the potential to waste those resources will be higher than it is hardly earned through taxation resources. So that's the rationale behind those hypotheses. And the sociological view, I've looked at two or three indicators, one dealing with popular frustrations, this one capturing the understanding, the umbrella term of corruption, that corruption is an umbrella term for just general frustrations, that when people talk about a lot of corruption, they're just not happy with what's going on, and popular frustrations could be captured with protest potential in the regions. And information flows, the importance of information flows and what is the information that regional population has access to, which I measured through media freedom and also internet usage. Okay. I'm going to shift to the results with potential data questions that you might have, leaving that to the discussion. There are some demonstrations of how the independent variables look. I can also show that, each of them, later on. Okay. I used ordered logit regressions for the categorical variable, the one that's corruption as an obstacle, 0 to 4, and I had a continuous variable for the share of sales used as informal payments, and I used the Heckman selection model. I can talk about it a little bit later. The four model specification depended on the multicollinearity issues because margin of victory and voting turnout were correlated, and free media is also correlated with many of the variables. So I had four different specifications. Okay, now looking at the results, they are not fabulous, but on the indicators for political competition or political centralization, I should say I didn't find significance of the margin of victory there was something that's worth of considering with voting turnout, positive association with general bribery levels. Let's see here, I have the tables. Unfortunately, I had to organize my tables in such a way that there are many indicators of corruption, so each one gets a special table. So there are many tables, but you can just, at this point, look at the indicators I talk about, like the margin of victory, voting turnout. So the voting turnout had positive in some of the, so we have here positive association, frequency of informal payments to get things done, shows positive association with greater voting turnout. Respondents, the regions with greater voting turnout also have a higher rate of respondents that talk about greater general bribery levels. There is informal payments to courts. In the third model specification, there is positive association. Informal payments to tax collection officers gives positive association. Informal payments to parliamentarians, these are state capture indicators, also positive here. Especially model 3 reveals that. Now, going back to my results section, still, my general conclusion is that the results are still quite inconclusive and more probing needs to be done on this. With regard to natural resources, I see negative correlation on frequency of bribes, but positive correlation on bribes to courts. Once again, I can show the tables later on. Dependence on federal transfers gives more consistent results with negative correlation with corruption as an obstacle. So the higher the dependence on federal transfers for regional budgets produce lesser corruption perceptions in terms of when measured as the frequency of bribes. I'm sorry, I'm looking at natural resources. Corruption as an obstacle, frequency of bribes, including bribes to courts and tax collection, no significant correlations on state capture indicators. So in terms of the more rationalist hypothesis, I do not see very strong trends here to report. And I do not claim that this is sort of one and for all testing, so there might be other ways to test and potentially other sources of data, but that's my report on that. In terms of sociological conceptualization of how corruption might work, I saw more interesting trends, and here there is a very consistent result on positive, and I guess also not surprising, on positive correlation with the measure of actual corruption of political protests with the measure of actual corruption, frequency of bribes in general, bribes expected to customs imports, courts, tax collection authorities, and greater state capture. So on many of the tables, the protest variables work to show positive correlations. People who are frustrated, unhappy, protest prone also are more open about their corruption perceptions and report higher levels of corruption perceptions as seen from reports by economic actors. So that's one interesting finding there. And also on the information flows, the internet non-usage. Here the answer, the question is CIOM-based data, people who answer, I have not used internet, I do not use internet, and the proportion of the non-usage in each region produces the higher that proportion is, the less are the tendency to report actual corruption in one of the specifications, but also corruption perceptions in terms of corruption as an obstacle, bribes to custom imports, court state capture, also produces negative correlation on the internet variable. With free media, I had findings that were a bit against my expectations based on my earlier research about political competition, free media, and how that works to increase corruption perceptions. Here, in many of the tables, I see the freer the media, there is negative, lesser firms in regions with freer media report lesser frequency of bribes in general, as well as specifically to customs, courts, tax collections, etc., and also see less state capture. So to me, this is a puzzle, outstanding puzzle. I tend to think about the need to also get maybe Gulnaz Defense Foundation data on free media to see non-expert based assessments of free media and use that to compare what the results will be. But in terms of major final sort of conclusions and take-home message, to my mind, sociological approaches appear to have more promise in making sense of the key findings. We do need to keep in mind data validity. That's why I mentioned the free media indicator, and also in interpreting the data from BEEPS, it's really important to think about, what are the firms that are answering the questions. And as years go by, the political economic situation in Russia moves in the direction of firm selection. Those who have stronger connections to political authorities survive. So my expectation will be that these firms would also be less likely to talk about corruption issues and corruption perceptions and more prone to underreporting. And this firm selection process needs to be taken into account, especially when we have intertemporal comparisons of corruption perceptions in the regions. And suggestions and comments are very welcome. Thank you very much for your attention.